Ever get that feeling where you're like, I really want to understand this thing, like inside and
Yeah.
out, But then you realize it's going to take hours and hours of research.
Yeah, totally. It can feel super overwhelming trying to dig through all those academic papers and reports.
Exactly. But that's where we come in, right? We do the deep dive for you, sifting through all the research, all the jargon, and bringing you those key takeaways, those aha moments without making your head spin.
That's the goal. And today's topic, well, it's something that unfortunately never seems to go away, bullying in schools. But we're not going to just skim the surface here. We're going deep thanks to this really insightful research paper you brought to our attention.
Right. Toward a more comprehensive understanding of bullying in school settings by Carrera, De Palma, and Lameras, published back in 2011. And the aim here, as the title suggests, is to get a more complete picture of this complex issue, to go beyond those oversimplified explanations we often hear.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that bullying is more than just kids being kids. There's a lot more to unpack.
Hmm.
And it's an issue that's been around for way longer than we might think. The paper even mentions Tom Brown's school days from the 19th century as an early example of peer abuse.
Wow. Yeah, that book definitely painted a pretty grim picture of school life back then. But what's interesting is that the serious scientific study of bullying really only took off in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, right? Is this increased focus we have now more a reflection of growing academic interest or a genuine surge in bullying incidents?
It's a really good question, and it highlights how research in fields like educational psychology and developmental psychology has really shaped how we think about bullying, how we define it, and ultimately how we try to address it.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be exploring, well, what exactly is bullying? How do we define it? What are the different roles that people play in these situations? And I think particularly interesting, how does gender influence this whole phenomenon?
Those are the big questions, yeah. And starting with that first one, what is bullying? The paper actually talks about how the early research used the term mobbing, which kind of conjures up those images of animals ganging up on each other, right?
Yeah, it does sound pretty intense, like a pack of wolves or something.
Yeah.
But using that term mobbing, I guess, might have limited the scope of the early research by focusing mainly on those group attacks, right?
Exactly. Researchers like Lorenz and Picos who use that term, they were really looking at those group dynamics. And then came along Dan Olius in the late 1970s. His definition of bullying, repeated exposure to negative actions over time, really laid the groundwork for so much of the research that followed. It was, and still is, a huge influence on how we understand this issue.
It really was a turning point. And that definition, I guess, led to this idea of bullying as a kind of systematic abuse of power. The paper mentions Smith and Sharp, who used that phrase to describe how bullying often involves an imbalance of power. Maybe someone's perceived as weaker, or they belong to a minority group, or maybe they just don't fit in for some reason.
Right. And what's really interesting is how other researchers have kind of built upon that idea. Ma and his colleagues, for example, they defined bullying as these repeated actions that create a power imbalance, which then ends up satisfying the aggressor, while causing distress to the victim. So that power dynamic, it's a consistent thread throughout these different definitions.
It is. But there's a point made in the paper that kind of surprised me. There isn't actually a universally agreed upon definition of bullying. Apparently, different cultures and even the specific words used to describe it can emphasize different aspects of the behavior. Like in Italy, they use bullismo, and in Japan, it's ijime. And they might focus more on physical harm versus, say, social exclusion.
Yeah, that lack of a single internationally recognized definition does make things tricky. It becomes harder to compare research findings from different countries and come up with global strategies for prevention. Because, even the language we use carries these cultural assumptions and baggage. But despite those variations, the authors of this paper, they draw upon a lot of previous research, Olbius, Solberg, others, to identify some core characteristics of bullying that are pretty widely accepted, at least when we're talking about peer abuse in schools.
Okay, so what are those core characteristics? Give us the rundown.
So, firstly, it's generally considered a subtype of aggressive behavior. Secondly, it involves a whole range of negative actions. We're talking physical, psychological, or social. And crucially, those actions, they happen repeatedly and they cause harm. There's also this element of intentionality. It's not just accidental, there's a conscious aim to inflict pain or distress, and it's generally understood that the victim hasn't provoked these actions. And lastly, it can be carried out by an individual or a group, but it's usually directed at a single victim.
Okay, so that gives us a good framework for what we're talking about. Now, who are the players in all this? I mean, we typically think about the bully and the victim, right? But it sounds like the research suggests a more Well, a more nuanced picture.
Absolutely. While those two roles, the bully and the victim, were the initial focus of Alamase's work, later research, like that by Stevenson and Smith, has identified a really important third category, the bully victim. This is someone who both experiences bullying and also perpetrates it. And more recently, there's been a lot of interest in the role of bystanders, those who witness bullying but aren't directly involved.
Right, the onlookers. And the paper points out that research increasingly shows that bullying is dynamic, it's pervasive, and it's not just limited to those immediate interactions.
You got it. Samavali, Swearer, and others, they've really emphasized that if we only look at the bully and the victim, we miss a lot of the bigger picture. Now, focusing on the victims, well, research has traditionally categorized them into two main types.
I think the one that most people think of first is that passive submissive victim.
Hmm.
The one characterized by anxiety, maybe physical weakness. And the paper points out that this is often the case with boys, especially when it comes to physical abuse.
Right, that's sort of the stereotypical image, yeah. But then there's the provocative victim. This is someone who also experiences anxiety but tends to react in a more aggressive way, which unfortunately can irritate peers or even teachers. Olvia suggested that this type is less common, maybe about 1 in 5 victims. And interestingly, this type of victim overlaps with what some researchers call aggressive victims or bully victims.
Oh, I see. So someone who is targeted but then lashes out in response.
Yeah.
And speaking of gender, what about how it plays a role in who becomes a victim?
Yeah.
The paper mentions girls often identifying more with relational or social bullying. What exactly does that look like?
Think social sabotage, basically. Actions aimed at damaging someone's reputation or relationships. It's about harming their social standing. So, things like exclusion, spreading rumors, manipulating friendships. Underwood and Rosen have done some really interesting work on relational aggression. And while we might assume boys are more likely to be victims overall, the research actually suggests girls are equally or even more likely to be victimized, particularly through these relational tactics. And boys are more likely to be identified as the bullies or the bully victims. But here's something that kind of surprised me. The paper points out that the role of girls in bullying dynamics has historically been under-researched.
Yeah, that is surprising. What about age? Does that play a role in victimization?
Well, research by Harries and others found that victimization is actually highest in elementary school and then gradually decreases as students move into secondary school. When we look at physical characteristics, victims are often described as being younger, shorter, weaker. Even their clothing choices can sometimes make them targets.
Like they don't quite fit in, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And having disabilities or learning difficulties, being overweight, or being perceived as unattractive, those things are also linked to a higher likelihood of victimization. And importantly, the paper emphasizes that other factors like ethnicity, immigrant background, social disadvantage, and LGBTQ plus status, those have received less attention in traditional bullying research. It's a significant gap in our understanding.
Absolutely. And beyond physical characteristics, are there personality traits commonly associated with those who were victimized?
Yeah, some traits that pop up a lot are sensitivity, lack of assertiveness, and low levels of aggression. Also anxiety, insecurity, low self-esteem. Victims often tend to blame themselves for what's happening, have trouble resolving conflicts, and exhibit lower motivation. There can even be signs of depression. A lot of researchers like Sullivan and Hazier have really explored these aspects. It sounds like a really tough cycle to be stuck in.
It does. It really does.
Yeah. And socially, victims often have fewer friends. They might be afraid of going to school, which can lead to absenteeism, and then that can affect their academic performance. They might not participate as much in school activities. They might seem less connected to the school environment overall. Interestingly, the paper mentions that victims, especially boys, often report having close relationships with their parents, but there's also a link to families where there might be abuse or very strict authoritarian parenting styles. It's a complex picture.
Very complex. Now let's talk about the bullies themselves. The paper outlines two main types, active and passive bullies.
Right. So the active bully is the one who engages in direct harassment. Often seen as the leader, tends to be impulsive, assertive, sometimes physically stronger, easy to provoke, and importantly, often lacks empathy and doesn't feel guilty about their actions. This is the majority of bullies. Then you have the passive bully, sometimes called the henchman or follower. This person often has lower self-esteem, less confidence, and they participate in bullying to try to gain social standing through association with the active bully.
Makes sense. And we can't talk about bullies without acknowledging the gendered aspects of who tends to bully, right?
Absolutely. Research consistently shows that boys are more likely to be identified as bullies. However, the way they bully often differs from girls. Girls tend to engage more in relational or social aggression, things like exclusion, spreading gossip, while boys are more likely to use verbal or physical aggression. This pattern even seems to extend to cyberbullying, with girls more involved in online gossip and boys in stuff like hacking or name-calling. Although it is important to note that the research isn't totally consistent on the extent of these gender differences, especially when it comes to relational aggression.
So it's not always as simple as girls do this, boys do that. There's overlap and nuance,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Some studies find less clear distinctions, even cases where boys report higher levels of relational aggression. And we also need to remember that the types of aggression used can change as kids get older. Physical aggression generally decreases in middle childhood and adolescence, while social aggression tends to increase. But again, this isn't a hard and fast rule, it varies.
What about the psychological and social characteristics of bullies? Anything stand out there?
Well, they're often described as being more aggressive, more impulsive, and this might surprise you, but they can actually have pretty high levels of self-esteem. While they might not be as well integrated into the overall school social structure as those who aren't involved in bullying, they are typically better integrated than their victims. And here's where things get really interesting. Some research actually highlights their popularity and even their role as social leaders within peer groups.
Popular bullies. That sounds almost counterintuitive. How do researchers explain that?
One earlier idea was that maybe these individuals are part of peer groups where there aren't many positive ways to gain recognition or status, so they resort to aggression to get that attention. More recently, researchers have developed this concept of the Machiavellian bully, someone who's socially skilled, they use non-coercive tactics, and they possess qualities that are valued by the group. That leads to popularity. So it's not always about brute force, it can be about social manipulation.
Wow. And like with victims, the family backgrounds of bullies have been studied too, right?
Yes, definitely. A lot of research has focused on that. And common themes that emerge are insecure attachment to parents, a lack of trust in parents, a more negative overall family environment. There's often a lack of clear boundaries and limits. And parenting styles that are either very authoritarian or overly permissive, sometimes involving physical punishment, are more common in the backgrounds of bullies. Interestingly, even having a larger number of siblings has been linked to being a bully, maybe because of more competition for attention and resources within the family.
Okay, so complex family dynamics can definitely play a role. Now, we can't forget about the bully victims, right? The ones who are both perpetrating and experiencing abuse. The paper mentions this group is receiving more and more attention from researchers.
For sure, they're no longer just seen as fitting neatly into either the bully or victim category. They're sometimes called aggressive victims, and they share some characteristics with both traditional victims and those who bully. The key thing, of course, is that they're actively involved in bullying, both as the one inflicting harm and the one being harmed. Research suggests this is more common among boys, and their prevalence tends to decrease as kids get older.
What about the characteristics that make them unique?
Well, they often have poorer physical health, they tend to have been involved in bullying dynamics for a longer time, and they're more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. There's also a potential link to disabilities. They can be aggressive, impulsive, and despite their involvement in bullying, they're generally less popular than their peers. Their family backgrounds are often described as less stable or more dysfunctional. They're considered a higher risk group, potentially stuck in a cycle of aggression, trying to regain some sense of power after being victimized themselves. It's complicated, to say the least.
It really is. And the paper makes a really crucial point here. It challenges this idea that the roles bully victim are fixed and unchanging. It highlights the importance of social group dynamics in understanding how bullying plays out. Research on cliques and peer groups suggests these fluid power structures, driven by who's in and who's out, can actually determine who occupies which role at any given time, sometimes even more so than individual personality traits.
Right. So it's not just about individual psychology, it's about that social environment, the dynamics of the group. And that brings us to the social ecological model, which has become really influential in how we understand bullying. It moves our focus from the individual to the wider context, the school, the family, the neighborhood. For example, studies have found that being socially rejected at school can lead to lower teacher expectations, which is then linked to loneliness and poor academic achievement. Things like delinquency within the school, peer influence, the presence of gangs, and low levels of social support, those all play a role. On the flip side, research shows that secure attachments within the family can actually make young people more likely to support victims of bullying. And even the level of safety and security in the neighborhood can be a factor.
And another critical element within these peer groups are the spectators, the bystanders. Their inaction, it can often be interpreted as tacit approval or support for the bullying that's happening.
Exactly. The homophily hypothesis, which basically says that individuals within a group tend to react in similar ways, that applies here. So if bullying is seen as normal or acceptable within a particular group, it creates this really dangerous dynamic. Interestingly, research suggests that girls actually have more negative attitudes toward bullying and are more likely to either defend someone or refuse to participate. Ultimately, the social climate of the school as a whole and individual classrooms is really key in effectively addressing bullying.
Yeah, it really paints a much more intricate picture than that simplistic idea of bad kids picking on weak kids.
Yeah.
Now, the paper goes on to discuss some of the limitations of this more traditional or classical analysis of bullying. It suggests it might be too narrow, maybe too focused on boys' experiences, and perhaps overlooking some key aspects of how bullying plays out.
Yeah, the authors argue that a lot of the traditional research has been, well, somewhat reductionist and essentialist, sometimes even relying on biological explanations for gender differences and overemphasizing the experiences of boys. They break these limitations down into issues with how bullying is conceptually defined and the inherent problems with the traditional bully-victim dichotomy.
Let's start with those conceptual limitations, how we actually define bullying. The paper raises questions about what negative actions tend to get the most research attention.
Exactly. So while the definition of bullying has expanded beyond just physical aggression to include things like social exclusion, the main focus, even today, often remains on the more direct forms of aggression, whether it's physical or verbal. And Hawker and Bolton did this meta-analysis, and they actually criticized how little attention was given to relational or indirect forms of victimization, arguing that this leads to an underestimation of the problem and can even skew how we interpret the research findings.
That makes sense. I mean, it's easier to see and measure a punch than it is to measure the damage done by spreading rumors or excluding someone from a group.
Right, and that has real-world implications. Yoon and Kerber found that teachers often show more sympathy towards students who are victims of physical and verbal abuse and are less likely to intervene in situations involving social exclusion. But as Booz and others have pointed out, peer exclusion can have really serious negative effects. Interestingly, though, more recent research suggests that teachers might actually have a broader understanding of bullying compared to students, who still tend to focus mainly on direct abuse. Teacher training programs seem to be making a difference.
That's encouraging. What about sexist or homophobic attacks? Where do they fit in with this traditional definition of bullying?
Well, the paper highlights a kind of ambivalence around this. Some argue that these types of attacks don't really fit the standard definition of bullying if there isn't a clear sense of personal or direct harm involved, even though they clearly cause distress. This has led to this kind of implicit separation in research. You have studies on classic bullying, then separate studies on sexual harassment, and still other research focusing specifically on homophobia. The authors argue these divisions are conceptual limitations, and we really need to be looking at how all these different forms of harm are interconnected.
So by treating, say, sexual harassment or homophobic abuse as completely separate issues, we miss the bigger picture of how kids are being mistreated by their peers.
Exactly. And Meyer actually proposes an alternative framework. He distinguishes between bullying, which is typically repeated and intentional, and harassment, which might not be intentional or directly targeted, but is often driven by prejudice. Then there's the concept of gendered harassment, which sits at the intersection and includes sexual harassment, homophobic harassment, transphobic harassment, basically any behavior that reinforces traditional gender norms.
And the whole thing about those traditional criteria for defining bullying, intentionality, repetition, power imbalance, it sounds like those aren't always as straightforward as they might seem.
You're right, there's a lot of debate around those criteria. Intentionality, for example, it's inherently subjective. It's hard to really know a bully's true intentions, and sometimes even the bully themselves might not be fully aware of the harm they're causing. Swain points out how blurred the lines can be between joking and abuse, and how often hurtful jokes are just accepted in classrooms. Ringrose and Reynolds talk about normative cruelties, everyday forms of oppression that aren't usually included in discussions about bullying, but they can still cause a lot of anxiety and fear. Lahoma did this really interesting ethnographic research, and she found that the line between playful interactions and those that are genuinely painful, it's really thin. And sometimes teachers downplay these everyday cruelties.
So what one person might just see as teasing, another person might experience as deeply hurtful. And that distinction isn't always clear.
Exactly. And trying to measure harm from an outsider's perspective, that's really tricky. What looks like playful border work to one person might be experienced as really upsetting sexual harassment by another. Onkatukia found that many girls who'd experienced sexual harassment didn't even identify it as happening at school, suggesting it's not always seen as abuse, but rather as a normal part of adolescent relationships. And when teachers view it as normal, they're less likely to intervene. Bansal and colleagues highlight how lots of harmful jokes are just taken in stride as typical behavior for that age group, even though they can lead to real harm and exclusion. And then there's the issue of power imbalance, which is hard to identify when it's not obvious, like when it's related to things like social status or cultural norms.
Yeah, it's not always about who's bigger or stronger. It's about those more subtle forms of power. And then there's that repetition criterion, right? The idea that an incident has to happen more than once to be classified as bullying. That's got its limitations too, doesn't it?
Definitely. While Ovius emphasized repetition in his definition, he also acknowledged that a single incident, if it's serious enough, can be bullying. Ringrose and Reynolds argue that focusing only on repetition ignores the fact that even abuse that isn't prolonged can still cause real suffering. And while that repetition criterion might be helpful in research to avoid overestimation, it might not be so useful when we're talking about practical strategies for prevention and intervention. Cornell and Shiras actually found that school counselors sometimes reclassified students who self-identified as victims based on whether they met those strict criteria about frequency or perceived harm, which raises questions about how helpful those rigid boundaries really are in practice.
So focusing too much on those strict definitions might actually make us miss a lot of what's really going on and causing harm. And now onto the second major limitation the paper identifies. The traditional bully-victim binary and that often gender-blind or essentialist view of gender.
This is a really important point. The authors argue that focusing mainly on individual characteristics, like personality traits, family upbringing, that reinforces this idea of a clear victim and a perpetrator. It leads to this focus on blaming and punishing individuals, which is reflected in those zero tolerance policies we see, which, by the way, haven't really been shown to be all that effective. In these traditional models, power is often seen as just these deliberate acts of individual aggression, and researchers tend to look for causes within the individual or their home environment. That kind of ignores the bigger picture, the situational and sociocultural aspects of power and identity, including things like gender, sexuality, social background, all those things that make up who we are and how we experience the world.
It's like looking at individual trees and missing the whole forest.
Precisely. And while the social ecological model, did broaden things out to include the school, the family, the neighborhood, the authors argue that it hasn't been fully integrated into bullying research, and it still often operates alongside that reductionist, dualistic model. And crucially, it doesn't fully address the impact of those larger systems like gender socialization.
So even when we consider the school and the family, we still might be missing how those broader societal expectations around gender come into play.
Exactly. And the paper argues that we often fail to acknowledge that even those who bully can be, in a sense, victims themselves, victims of power-laden socialization processes, particularly those tied to patriarchal and heterosexist notions of identity. These ideas, they get transmitted through the family, the media, peer groups, even the school itself. And often, identities are constructed in part through acts of violence and the exclusion of those who don't conform to these narrow gender norms. So it's not about excusing bullying, but understanding the wider context.
And then there's the issue of how gender has been approached in bullying research. First with this kind of gender blindness, and then with what they call essentialization.
Right, so the early research pretty much just focused on boys, both as victims and bullies. Girls' experiences were largely ignored. Their behavior, because it was often less disruptive, was seen as less problematic, which reinforced this idea that girls don't experience oppression or engage in harmful behavior. Then came the discovery of relational aggression, which led to this kind of binary understanding. Boys are physically and verbally aggressive, girls are relationally aggressive. This approach tended to essentialize gender, sometimes even attributing these differences to biological factors without really exploring the social factors that might be shaping these behaviors.
Like saying boys will be boys and girls will be girls and leaving it at that.
Exactly. So while this did bring girls into the picture, a lot of the research still didn't move beyond seeing gender as just biological sex. Some studies explored potential differences in motivations. Maybe girls bully for social connection, boys for power. Or they suggested girls might be less likely to bully because they're more sensitive. but they didn't really look at how socialization might lead to those differences. Even the social ecological model, with a few exceptions, tended to analyze gender as a biological variable within those immediate contexts, without looking at those broader cultural mechanisms.
So we need to move beyond just noting differences and really understand how society creates and reinforces those differences.
Yes, and some recent studies are taking that approach. They use a constructivist perspective and see gender not just as a biological category, but as a cultural, hierarchical, social construct. This helps us understand how that whole system around sex and gender reinforces those ideas about men and women that we all grew up with. The association of aggression and power with men and passivity with women, and then acts of violence against those who don't conform to those stereotypes, especially against boys who are seen as more feminine. That becomes a way to perform and assert a certain type of masculinity. Some researchers talk about doing gender to emphasize that gender is not something we are, it's something we actively do.
And the paper mentions Felix and Grief Green, who argue that the social ecological model needs to include that broader patriarchal system to really understand bullying.
Right. They and others like Garando, they point out that the gender inequality we see in schools, it often reflects broader societal issues. Underwood and Rosen argue that any prevention and intervention programs need to consider how patriarchal norms shape both boys' and girls' participation in bullying. And there's been research looking at the link between personality stereotypes, things like instrumentality, which is associated with masculinity, and expressivity, which is associated with femininity and bullying roles. They found some interesting connections, often regardless of biological sex. For example, boys who are seen as more feminine and girls seen as more masculine are more likely to be victimized, especially boys. And those traits associated with masculinity, those are often linked to bullying behavior in both boys and girls. There's also growing evidence that sexist and homophobic attitudes are linked to a higher likelihood of bullying. So it's not just about being male or female, it's about how much you conform to or deviate from those gender expectations.
So it's not just being male or female, but how you perform those roles that society expects of you.
Exactly. And this idea is further explored by those who take a post-structuralist perspective. They use qualitative research to understand how young people themselves make sense of their experiences and how doing gender, performing those expected behaviors, excluding those who don't conform, how that plays out in bullying. For example, research in the UK has shown how girls might use relational aggression as a way to compete for relationships within that virgin whore binary, while boys might use verbal and physical aggression or those ritualized joking behaviors as a way to perform their masculinity. And then these behaviors become normalized. It's just seen as typical for that age group and gender. Reynolds calls it the gaming of violence.
So the big takeaway here is that bullying can actually be a way of actively performing gender. And those who don't fit those narrow expectations, they get punished.
Right. Bullying, for boys, can be a way of enacting masculinity through aggression. For girls, relational bullying can be a way of performing femininity. And those who don't fit neatly into those boxes are often the ones who suffer the consequences.
It's a really powerful insight. So how do we move toward a more comprehensive understanding of bullying, both in terms of how we analyze it and how we intervene? The paper offers three main approaches.
Yeah. Broadening those restrictive definitions of bullying, moving beyond the bully-victim dichotomy, and incorporating a more accurate understanding of gender, one that goes beyond biological sex.
So let's start with broadening the definitions. The paper talked about the limitations of focusing solely on repeated intentional aggression with a clear power imbalance.
Right. And while those criteria are widely accepted, how they're actually interpreted and applied in research can vary a lot. The repetition criterion, as we discussed, excludes those single incidents that can cause just as much pain and distress. And intentionality, power imbalance, those can be really hard to assess accurately. How can we really know what's going on in a bully's mind, or the degree to which the victim's pain is intentional? And power imbalances, they're not always visible. We need to consider those less obvious power dynamics, like those created by patriarchal or heterosexist norms, which haven't always been adequately addressed in bullying research.
So taking into account the victim's experience, not just checking boxes on a list.
Exactly. Cornell and his colleagues actually call the measurement of bullying the Achilles heel of research in this area because it's so hard to distinguish it from other forms of victimization or even roughhousing. It's important to consider the students' perspectives, what causes them pain, not just rely on an outsider's evaluation. A more comprehensive approach would consider those instances of everyday cruelty, even if they don't strictly meet the criteria, and recognize that our very understanding of power shapes how we define bullying in the first place. The authors agree with Scher and Larson that power imbalance is critical, and those power relations are shaped by the broader cultural context.
Okay, so looking beyond the individual incident, considering the wider context, and how do we move beyond that bully-victim dichotomy?
The paper argues we need to move away from simply labeling people as either victims or perpetrators. Instead, we need to try to understand those complex interactions between identity and those underlying structures of power and submission, and how those dynamics shape kids' social lives in schools. The social ecological model, that's a valuable framework, but it needs to be more fully integrated into bullying research. And this perspective, it also needs to address its own limitations. It tends to emphasize that immediate social context over broader social and cultural expectations. And it hasn't really moved past that oppressor dichotomy.
So not just individual roles, not even just their immediate surroundings, but the larger social forces at play. And finally, how do we incorporate a more accurate understanding of gender?
This is so important. We need to move beyond those essentialist views of gender and really recognize how important it is in understanding bullying. We need to draw on those constructivist and post-structuralist perspectives, like those highlighted by Felix and Grief Green, Carrera and colleagues, Gini and Pizzoli, and Young and Sweeting. Recent research has shown that behaviors associated with bullying, as well as those normalized forms of everyday oppression, they have a strong gender component. Those contemporary understandings of gender, they give us the tools for a much more comprehensive analysis of bullying dynamics.
And how do we translate all this research into actual practice? The paper has some specific suggestions, right?
Yes. First, we need to pay attention to those normalized, accepted, everyday classroom practices that can cause harm. These aren't just side issues, they're part of that whole complex social construction of bullying, like hurtful nicknames, that can be a form of direct bullying. Gossiping, that's a form of indirect bullying. Second, we need more flexibility in those criteria we use to define bullying, especially when it comes to intentions and repetition. A wider perspective is needed, considering power imbalances that might not be immediately obvious, like those related to belonging to a dominant or privileged group. Third, we need more research on how those social categories that make up a person's identity, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, how those intersect and influence their experiences of bullying. Ignoring harm that's based on those fundamental aspects of someone's identity, that's basically denying their basic rights. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being targeted for who you are, and we need to recognize how these complex social and cultural factors intersect. Like, sexual harassment often overlaps with other forms of bullying.
So we need to look at the bigger picture of social justice and how inequality plays out in bullying.
Exactly. And fourth, it's crucial for both research and practice to analyze gender as a social construct, not just an individual biological trait. Our measurement tools, they need to include questions about gender-related traits, behaviors, attitudes towards sexism and homophobia, beliefs about gender conformity. And this data needs to be gathered in different ways: self-reports, peer and teacher nominations, and qualitative methods like observations and discussion groups. Prevention and intervention programs for both teachers and students, they need to highlight the widespread nature of bullying, help people understand that gender is socially constructed, promote more flexible gender boundaries, and actively value sexual diversity in the classroom.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. So just to recap, we've moved from that narrow focus on individual bullies and victims to recognizing how important social dynamics, power structures, and gender are in understanding this issue.
We've highlighted the limitations of those traditional definitions and how crucial it is to really listen to the experiences of those who are being harmed, even in situations that might seem minor to an outsider.
And we've emphasized the need to move beyond those bully victim categories and recognize the complex interplay of identity and power.
Absolutely. Understanding how gender norms and stereotypes contribute to both bullying behaviors and victimization, that's key to developing more effective and more just prevention and intervention strategies that address those root social and cultural causes of bullying.
So to you, the listener, we leave you with this thought. How might those everyday interactions and social dynamics in schools, those things we often take for granted, how might they be either contributing to or challenging those bigger issues of bullying and social justice? What role, big or small, can you play in creating a more inclusive and equitable environment for everyone?
It's a question worth pondering.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought.